All right. Okay. Hi, everyone. Well, let's start then. Just a sec. Okay, right. So let's start as usual with some breathing, followed by setting the motivation. And now visualize in the space in front of you Buddha Shakyamuni, who manifests in the form of a fully ordained monk. Manifesting all the qualities that we ourselves can also attain. And inseparable from your Lama. And then think that the Buddha in the space in front of you is surrounded by all the great masters of the different traditions. He's surrounded by the great Indian masters of the Nalanda tradition like Nagarjuna, Ayadeva, and so forth. Likewise, he's surrounded by all the great lamas, the great masters of Tibet. And by the masters of other countries, masters of China, Vietnam, but also by the masters of the Pali tradition, of Thailand, Burma, and so forth. With all of these great beings, again, being one nature with your Lama. And then visualize that you're surrounded by all sentient beings. Filling the horizon in all directions. Their mere presence, their mere existence, being so important for our spiritual development. And although their mind is, by its very nature, completely pure, and not different from that of a Buddha, due to their root ignorance, they experience countless problems. Difficulties, worries, and all the other types of sufferings. And so fast generate affectionate love towards all these sentient beings by they're generating a feeling of affection, of closeness, based on tolerance and acceptance of all their faults, which are not in the nature of their mind. Make that affection as genuine as possible, as sincere and genuine. As if you were to generate this for the first time, coming from the depth of your heart. And then pay attention to the incredible suffering that sentient beings are going through. Innumerable worries, different types of anxiety, physical pain, mental pain. all the other unwanted experiences. And generate the sincere wish, may they be free from all these problems, these unwanted experiences, together with the causes that give rise to them. And may I be able to do whatever is necessary to protect them from their suffering and its causes. Generate that sincere and deep aspiration to help sentient beings to overcome their problems. To help them to overcome whatever's in their way to attain liberation. And that aspiration then grows stronger and turns into a special altruistic attitude that is, it transforms into the determination to do whatever is necessary and however long it takes to help sentient beings to remove whatever's in the way to their liberation. Nothing is more important in our lives than that goal. But since we can only effectively accomplish this once we become a Buddha, once we've attained enlightenment, let's generate the sincere aspiration or even determination to become fully enlightened for the welfare of all sentient beings. And again, try to feel this mind of enlightenment from the depth of your heart. And then also think that it's with this motivation that I will study Chandrakirti's entering into the middle way. And then without letting go of bodhicitta, let's recite the prayers. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits, of practicing generosity, and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits, of practicing generosity, and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from happiness that is free from suffering. And may all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. And then directed at the merit field. Reverently I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time. And rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence. And turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of others to the great enlightenment. All right. Well, festival for this coming week, practices to do. Well, there's still part of the method to attaining bodhicitta, so part of the technique that is set forth, well, by Manjushri and Shantideva and so forth. So these great masters, as explained in their works, in their teachings, especially, well, Shantideva's. So we spoke about here this technique as called equalizing and exchanging self with others. So the equalizing part, we've been practicing that for a few weeks, getting a sense of I and others being equally important, so that we're able to actually exchange ourselves for others, which doesn't mean we turn into others. It's just this kind of mental sense that others' mind and body are just as important than my own, and to act accordingly. So the reasons that were given so far were, well, first in terms of becoming equal, so others becoming equally important than ourselves, equally important as ourselves. So others in the sense, well, being important, as we've heard over and over, on a physical level, like for our physical well-being, for our mental well-being, our spiritual well-being. Of course, on a conventional level, there's no real difference between ourselves and others in that they're just like ourselves, just like myself, wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer. And of course, on an ultimate level, lacking inherent existence. So I don't exist inherently, and others don't exist inherently either. So the I being merely labeled on the basis of this mind and body. And it's just from that perspective, from this perspective here, that I say I. Although on the other hand, others are also I, just from their own perspective. So they have their own self, they have their own, there's their mind, their body, and from their perspective, there's I, which means therefore that there's no inherent I. The I is merely labeled, independent on certain other factors, such as the mind that does the labeling from its perspective. This is I, but then from another perspective, others are I. And so to become aware of it, become aware of this, and then, well, ideally to generate this equality, the sense of equality, or, well, to equalize ourselves with others in that we understand there's no real difference between us. And it does not make sense, therefore, that I just cherish myself, that I put myself, my own well-being, before everyone else's well-being. And instead, to then get a sense that others, others, really isn't any difference. We're part of the whole, we're part of humanity, if you like, or we're part of all sentient beings. And therefore there being no difference in terms of quality or importance and what have you. Well, quality in the sense, of course, there are Buddhas who've greater qualities, but all of us being sentient beings, all of us wanting to be happy, seeing ourselves as equal to others, then the next step would now be to exchange ourselves for others. So as I said before, you don't become another person. Of course, that's not what happens. However, you kind of visualize that so far we've put our own well-being, our own welfare, our own well-being in the forefront. Now let's do this with the welfare of others. And so Geshe Kelsang, he suggested in one of his teachings, he suggested, just think of another person. If you see another person, you become aware of another person, visualize that's you and you are another person, just for the sake of this meditation. So he actually suggested in a given situation, if you become aware of someone, just to familiarize the mind with this practice, to think, this is you, this is me, this is not, this is myself, I'm a stranger, and this other person is me. And just to grow familiar with the ability of the mind to actually do that, to kind of, well, make the mind more flexible in terms of putting the focus not on myself, but on the other person. And again, of course, we don't become the other person, but we'll find at some point we can actually change our focus away from ourselves and focus more on the other person. So this I would like you to do during your meditations, and maybe in other situations if you can. If you encounter other people, I don't know, you're at the supermarket, you're at the cashier, you're just waiting in line, and you see other people and you just think, this, I am a stranger, this other person. So I'm just a stranger to my own mind, but this other person, this is me. And just kind of grow more familiar with this idea. Of course, not knowing that this, of course, is not the case. We don't become another person, but like I said, just to grow closer towards others. And well, actually, the goal, of course, is eventually to be equally concerned, not just with our own welfare, but also being concerned for the welfare of other sentient beings. So that's the goal. And before we continue with the other steps, I'd like you to either do this practice if that feels comfortable, or just at least generate the sense, well, this other person is so important for whatever reasons, more important for my own well-being than myself. And for that reason, then focus more on the well-being of the other person. So exchange in the sense of like putting all your focus in terms of the well-being of the other person on the other person or other persons if you can. And so this is also based on the idea that, well, we are so concerned with our own well-being. We're mainly concerned with our own I, with our own self. And that has to do with, of course, being very concerned with our own mind and body. So seeing our own mind and body as more important than that of others. And if you think about this, so if you take your body, for instance, with the mind, it's slightly different. But with the body, for instance, well, we didn't have this body all the time. We were born with this particular body, yes. But if you believe in reincarnation, that we've lived before, then we certainly have had other bodies before. We were very familiar with the body of another human or maybe an animal or whatever, in whichever way we existed in the past. And so at some point, our mind grew closer and closer, or grew more and more familiar with the thought, my body, my body. But what is interesting is that there have been experiments with people, and I've mentioned this on different occasions before. It's the same experiment that I talked about before. There's a documentary about this, and I don't remember exactly the documentary, but it's about wearing these special glasses, if you like. It's like this, I forgot what it's called, like virtual reality or so. Anyway, there are these funny goggles that you wear and suddenly see like a totally different reality. And as part of this experiment, this person was wearing these special kind of goggles or whatever you call them. And when this person looked down on themselves, they would see the body of a dummy, of a dummy, like you see in a window in a store, for instance, like a mannequin. And so every time they looked down on themselves, they didn't see their own body, but the body of this particular dummy. And before long, the mind got used to it and they got a sense, this is my body. And they enhanced that by stroking the person's actual hand, and at the same time stroking, seeing, allowing this person or showing how the dummy that they were looking down on was also stroked in the same spot. And eventually they've developed a feeling, this is my own body, to such a degree when they took a knife and actually inserted the knife into the belly of the dummy that this person was looking down on, they experienced pain. So this actually shows that we can grow used to another body and get a sense, this is my own body. So all I'm trying to say with this is that our mind just grew familiar with this particular body, but there's no reason why our mind cannot be familiar with another body. So this being my body, being inherently my body, well, it isn't a tool. It's just temporarily. And in the same way as I can grow familiar with this body being so precious, well, I can grow familiar with not saying another person's body is my body. Well, as part of the exercise I introduced to you, well, maybe just as an exercise, not really believing in it, but seeing another person's body as just as precious as our own. We can grow familiar with this in the same way. So therefore, for this week, to focus on the fact that, well, first of all, as I said early on, try, if you can, to think, I'm the stranger, this other person is me. And just to allow the mind to be more familiar, especially with this focus on the other person, their well-being being more important, to practice that, but also to focus on the body in particular and become aware of my own body. Well, I'm only used to this particular body for as long as I have it as being my own and being so precious. But being precious, well, other bodies are just as precious. Others well-being, physical, here the focus being more on the physical, being in the same way as important as my own. Okay, so in that way, to go through this process of equal or exchanging. All right, so equalizing, we've done this over many weeks. Now I would like you to really exchange, to visualize you are the other person or other persons, if you can, and to also become aware the idea of the body, as I just described, that other people's bodies are just as precious. There's no reason why this is mine and therefore more precious. All right. Okay, so that should be enough for your meditation. And of course, the whole goal of it is to deepen your love, your compassion, and in particular, your mind of enlightenment. That is your bodhicitta. So the wish to become enlightened for the welfare of all sentient beings. And to use whatever you're doing in the meditation, of course, to then strengthen that particular mind. That should be, of course, your main focus, bodhicitta, the whole way through. And again, to generate it, as I talked about many times. All right. And then as to the question, well, as to questions, I received an email from someone called Tao Seti. Well, that's probably not his real name, since it's, as far as I know, it's the name of a star that's similar to the sun. But anyway, so this person, Tao Seti, wrote to me and introduced to me a kind of like a video, a movie on the mind. It's called Consciousness Mechanics. So maybe the person, well, actually Dalit has the email and has the link. So maybe Dalit could put it in the chat, but you can probably also find it if you Google it. Well, if you go to YouTube, it's a YouTube video, Consciousness Mechanics. I hope I said that right. I hope I got that right. Anyway, so if she can put it in the chat, Dalit, if you don't mind, if you can put it in there. And then also, he mentions the translation of the root text, and he seems to suggest that I translated it, but I didn't. So this is not clear yet. The root text we're following was translated by Geshe Jimba, just in case this was misunderstood. So I didn't translate that. That's one email I received, and then I received an email by Varda. We had there's this question she had before, and I asked her to put it in the context, in the right context. And anyway, she says she doesn't really remember. Oh, she also sent me a text, or an article, but I haven't looked at it yet. I didn't find the time yet. I'll do that next time. But she also goes into the question. She says, well, she doesn't really remember what the question was. There's a connection between dependent arising and emptiness, she says. And so the explanation she gives is the Chitta mantras say that there's nothing out there. Prasangika believed that there are things outside, while all empty of objective existence. Is dependent arising also empty of objective existence or inherent existence? And yes, of course, the answer is yes. How do you constitute things being outside, but do say that there's nothing at all phenomena empty of objective existence, but dependent arising? Okay, I'm not sure I understand it completely correctly. Pardon?
Sorry, it was not my question. It
was yours.
It was raised in a discussion, and
okay.
Nobody remembers what's the real question. So I put some notes.
Okay.
Just to tell you what was the reason. I was looking for the text.
Okay. All right. I see. Thank you. Well, okay. Anyway, so you say you have a text. Maybe we can put that in the chat, and it may be interesting for everyone else. And I'll have a look for next time. But maybe just to say something about it, because there still seems to be, well, Chittamatra still comes up. Jimmy mentioned he had a few questions regarding that. And it's an important distinction, I believe, to understand also the difference between, well, Chittamatra versus Prasangika, to understand that the difference, well, like I said many times, we're not moving away from the Chittamatra, from the mind only, as much as we may initially believe that we will do once we get to the, well, if we discuss the Chittamatra as part of our studies, not necessarily the study of the text we're doing here, but if it was part of your philosophy study, if you study Chittamatra, you may get a sense, well, at some point I move on to the Prasangika. But like I said, the difference between those schools is not as great as we may believe. So let me just say this again, to stress it again. The Chittamatra school is so important because their explanation that phenomena can only exist because there's the mind, because there's mind, that is so important also for the Prasangika. The Prasangika holds the same thing, that without mind, there can't be anything. Consciousness, mind, well, it is responsible for the existence of everything. In that way, they're very similar. They're very similar, Chittamatra, or they're the same, Chittamatra and Prasangika. So the importance of the mind in both schools is seen the same way. However, the Prasangika school, when they look at the Chittamatra saying there's no external existence, the Prasangika school would say, why do you say that? There's no contradiction in terms of saying phenomena, their existence is totally dependent on the mind. They cannot exist unless there were a mind. But still to say that they exist conventionally, external from the mind. Because if the Chittamatra school were to say, if the Chittamatra school says there's nothing out there, phenomena don't exist externally, well, they should also say a vase is not a vase. It's just an appearance to the mind. A tree is not a tree. It's just an appearance to the mind. But they insist on one hand that a tree is a tree, but they do not accept that there is external existence. So really, if they were totally consistent, they would have to say, well, the tree is also not a tree because it's just an appearance to the mind. So that distinction, why to say that a tree is a tree? So if a tree is seen as a tree, although it's just an appearance to the mind, well, just being an appearance to the mind, the tree and other phenomena, we can still say conventionally exists externally. But conventionally, it cannot exist inherently, which is what the Prasangika school denies. That whether you talk about it conventionally or not conventionally, it just does not make any sense. So in that sense, nothing can exist inherently. Why? Because if it did exist inherently, it would have to exist independently. And independent existence just does not make sense. It's impossible. Therefore, inherent existence, what does it really mean? The way phenomena appear to us is as if they existed inherently. But if they existed in that way, well, they would be self-contained. You wouldn't need anything else for them to exist. And then nothing would be possible. So dependent arising itself is also lacks inherent existence. It's also dependent on other factors. It's also just labeled. But in that mode of existence, not existed in and of themselves, not existing inherently, self-contained, if you like. Well, within that, they exist, so not existing that way, all phenomena exist as merely labeled, whether it's dependent arising itself or emptiness itself. So whatever exists, it always lacks inherent existence. But in that, we can say they exist externally, they exist the way they appear as is different from the mind, not inherently different, but different from the mind. Out there are trees and so forth. So not forgetting that this is still dependent on the mind, then conventionally it makes sense that they do exist that way. Anyway, so this is like a mixture of talking about it once again as thinking back of what Jimmy said, thinking of what Varda said, and I'm not sure I answered your question, but of course, you're welcome anytime to ask again. I'm not saying Varda, you, but anyone who's part of this discussion group. All right, so that should be enough with regard to questions. And then to return to the text, now to return to entering into the middle way, we got to verse 171. Yes. All right. Now, just quickly to say a few words about the previous verses that we discussed last time. Well, we had this discussion. We moved from phenomena such as vases and woolen cloth, and you remember these different examples that were given. Well, saying that these phenomena are merely labeled, they don't exist in and of themselves, not inherently. And the same is true, of course, for parts and qualities and cause, effect. All those, they depend on each other. So parts depend on the part bearer or the whole. The qualities depend on the quality bearer and vice versa. So whatever exists depends on a whole range of other phenomena. And of course, it depends on being labeled as this, that, and the other based on these phenomena. So independence on the mind, independence on other phenomena in the case of, like parts being dependent on the part bearer, cause being dependent on effect, and so forth. So all phenomena are merely labeled in dependence on all these different other phenomena. And so the focus was here so far, as this is part of refuting the existence of an inherent I, the focus is much more on what are phenomena? How do they exist? Okay. Versus how do they come in? How have they come into existence? There's these two parts to the analysis with regard to the existence of phenomena. Now, of course, as we all know, because we don't understand, we don't realize how phenomena really exist. That's why we suffer. That's why, therefore, it's so important to analyze how do phenomena really exist. And there's two ways in which we can analyze. We take any given phenomenon. Here, the focus is on the I. It could be anything else. Okay, so how does it exist? How did it come into existence? Both aspects we analyze. How does it exist? Well, we analyze this very extensively in terms of, well, what do we analyze when we analyze how does it exist? If the I were to exist inherently, we wouldn't have to take anything other than the I itself. Okay, if the I existed inherently, we could analyze just the I. We would be able to do that. But of course, we can't do that because we just say I. We're just repeating ourselves. But we need to analyze something other than the I. What is it? Mind and body. Okay, so we take mind and body and we analyze it in relation to the I. That's what we do when we analyze something in terms of its existence. But when we analyze, let's say, the I or any other phenomenon, but in this case, we take the I in terms of how came it into existence, then the analysis is slightly different because then we analyze the cause. Right? So the I being caused by something, the I being the effect of a certain cause. And that's where Chandrakirti is going after he's, well, explained to us in 166, 167, spoke about, well, even previous to that, how the I exists. We have that whole analysis. And he says, well, you can apply it to anything else, all other phenomena, when it comes to their existence. And then he moves back again to the analysis of cause and effect. So how does something like the I come into existence? And of course, the I has always existed, but in different forms. So if you think of yourself, the way you exist right now, well, if you do the analysis, you analyze your mind and body in relation to how does it exist in relation to the I of mind and body one, with the I? Are they different from the I? So we've done that analysis in the form of the 7 extremes, if you like. Does it like exist like this, like that, and so forth? Now, Chandrakirti moves towards how has this present I come into existence? So in terms of cause and effect, bringing in the causes as an example of this particular I being an effect. And in the same way as we did the analysis, well, the I and its aggregates, one or many, one or different, or you take something else, a vase and its parts, are they one or different? Here, the analysis between cause and effect, it's less of, it's not like, well, are the cause and effect one or different, but rather, do they meet or do they not meet? Do they come together or not? Why? Because obviously cause and effect different to a vase and its parts, a car and its parts, the I and its parts. So different to those because, well, the I and its parts, they exist at the same time. So when we analyze how a phenomenon exists, we analyze that phenomenon and its parts, and they exist at the same time. So we don't need to say, do they meet or not meet? Of course they meet, they exist at the same time. But then the analysis is, are they one? Are they different? Here, the analysis in terms of cause and effect, the analysis as well, because they don't, obviously, there is a time gap. First you have a cause, and then you have a result. And of course, they don't actually exist at the same time, but nevertheless, so based on that fact that if you have a cause and an effect, well, you don't analyze whether they're one or different, but rather, do they meet or do they not meet? Okay, so what does it mean to meet? To meet as in, like, well, the different possibilities, like 2 people meeting, for instance. Do they meet like 2 people meeting? But what does that actually mean? They meet. They talk to each other. I mean, they don't necessarily have to touch in that sense. So here, meet has much more of a sense, is there a time when they come together? And of course, that's impossible. There's no time when they come together. So if they were to meet, actually, if cause and effect were to meet in that way, they would actually have to merge. They would have to be one. Because this is of course based on being inherently existent. It's all based, the whole analysis is based on inherent existence in the sense of the way phenomena appear to us, of course. It's not based on conventional existence, but on inherent existence. So cause and effect, they do exist, they appear to us inherently, as if inherently existent. Let's now analyze. If they were to exist inherently and still exist, being cause and effect, do they meet or not meet? Do they come together? If they were to come together, well, they're certainly connected. And if they come together, then they have to be one. They have to merge. I mean, they have to be one, because if they weren't one and they're still connected, then one is dependent on the other. And that would mean they're not inherently existent because of the different phenomena and they're dependent on each other. How can they be inherently existent? Because inherently means you don't need nothing other than yourself to exist. So you don't need anything else. Therefore, the only possibility would be for the cause and effect, if they were to meet, if they were to exist at the same time at some point, there would be like a river merging into the ocean, just being one, being inseparable. And if their cause and effect are one, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you talk of a cause and an effect? I mean, they're just one. So at this point, I want to stress again, we have, of course, a tendency to say cause and effect, they're different. Of course, they're different. But if they're different, that would mean, since they're inherently different, they could not depend on each other, because they're self-contained. They don't need anything else. They're inherently this, that, and the other. They don't need anything other to exist. And so that would mean if then they don't meet and they're inherently existent, one is not the cause of the other. One is not the effect of the other. If they were to meet, they would just have to be one. because if they're connected and they are connected. I mean, if you said that they're connected, inherently existent and connected, well, then the only other way would be they're inseparable. Anyway, that takes a while to understand that there's no other possibility. Having said that, this is what Chandrakirti has argued in the verses that we went through last time. So if they're one, then what's the point? Cause and effect. I mean, like, one is no longer an effect, one is no longer a cause, so it doesn't make any sense. And of course, if they were separate, then again, one is not a cause, one is not an effect, because they have no connection. They're totally separate entities. So we've gone through this, and now this argument that Chandrakirti presents, directed at, of course, ourselves, believing in inherent existence, at least our mind definitely holds on to inherent existence, and of course also directed at those philosophers whose philosophy, like the Svatantrika, the Chittamatra, and so forth, who by their philosophy, or whose philosophy is such that phenomena exist inherently. They totally believe in that existence. So now Chandrakirti is arguing, like I just said, analyzing cause and effect, the way I just briefly mentioned, and now the opponent is coming back at Chandrakirti saying, well, if you present this analysis to me, if you say if something is a cause and effect and they exist inherently, there are only two possibilities. Either they meet and then they have to be one, or they don't meet and then they're totally disconnected. I can throw the same argument at you. All right. So now the argument, and that's verse 171, we didn't go through that last time. Now the argument is, does your refutation, okay, another passage is saying, does your refutation refute by coming into contact with what is being refuted? So here he's not taking cause and effect as such, like, I don't know, fire and fuel, or fire and smoke, or a seed and a sprout. No, he's saying your refutation, taking two things that are definitely connected, they're obviously connected. So he's saying, you, Chandrakirti, your refutation, the arguments you just presented, that's your refutation. What are you refuting? Our own assertion. Are those two coming into contact? Do they meet or do they not meet, right? If you present this analysis to us, the Svatantrika, for instance, whoever asserts inherent existence, but let's say it's probably directed at the Svatantrika directly, but could also be directed at anyone really asserting inherent existence. But let's say the Svatantrika, the Madhyamika Svatantrika school. So directing at them this analysis, this argument, the Svatantrika Madhyamika. And at some point, Lama Tsongkhapa says, actually, well, Baba Viveka, he mentions Baba Viveka, so directed at Baba Viveka, who's a follower of the Svatantrika Madhyamika. Okay, so he's saying, you guys, you're saying, so this Svatantrika Madhyamika person is now getting back at Chandrakirti, saying, if you analyze cause and effect in that way, if you tell us, well, the way we look at cause and effect, there are only two possibilities, then we're getting back at you with the same argument. You're positing a refutation of our own system. Our system is being refuted. And we can now say the same thing. We can ask you, does your refutation and that which you refute, do they come into contact? Do they meet or do they not meet, right? Applying the same argument, the same analysis. So does your refutation come into contact with what you're refuting, or does it refute something without coming into contact? So we can posit the same fold. You're guilty of the same fold. You're applying an argument here at us, or you're refuting our view of cause and effect through this question. Now we can use the same argument and can refute you by using the same argument. Indeed, they say, when you speak in such a manner, you undermine your own position, and your refutation will not have the power to refute what you're refuting. So the Svatantrika Madhyamika, getting back at the Prasangika, getting back at Chandrakirti, basically saying, if you're trying to refute our system using this argument, do they meet, do they not meet, we can use the same argument and refute you. All right. So saying, if you indeed speak in such a manner, as it says 171, if you apply these arguments, you're actually harming yourself. Your refutation will not have the power to refute what you're refuting, because you're refuting yourself. Okay. So then it goes on to say in 172, since your objections rebound to your words as well, you're committing a logical fallacy. Okay, so he talks of it as an objection that rebounds to his own words. This is something, and it's explained in this footnote. There's a footnote, actually, if you have the commentary illuminating the intent, the commentary by Lama Tsongkhapa on Chandrakirti's text, then you find there's a footnote. It's 805, footnote number 805, and it describes this logical fallacy that is described in verse 172. It has a particular name in Tibetan. It's difficult to translate. It's actually a rebounding argument, if you like, or a rebounding. It's a logical fallacy that's a rebounding argument, in the sense that if you present an argument, a logical argument, in order to refute the other person, if that refutation that you present actually refutes your own system, then you have this particular problem. Then then it's a case of this rebounding argument. Now, I'll just read this footnote, because I think Geshe Thupten Jinpa does a great job explaining this particular logical fallacy that the Svatantrikas are accusing Chandrakirti of, or accusing the Prasangika of. So what is this logic fallacy? It refers to specific types of flaws identified in classical Indian logic of debate, such as in the 6th chapter, or chapter 6 of Dignaga's Compendium of Valid Cognition. All right, so here, of course, what is Chandrakirti doing? What did Chandrakirti do? He applied logic in order to refute the Svatantrika. Okay, so there's a whole system of logic, Buddhist logic. And who set forth this Buddhist logic? It was set forth by Dignaga. And Dignaga's commentary called Compendium of Valid Cognition. And then based on that commentary and based on that work, there was a commentary by Dharmakirti, who composed a 4-chapter another work, a commentary on Dignaga's work, that has 4 chapters. Anyway, in here, Thupten Jinpa only mentions Dignaga's 6th chapter. In that particular chapter, he talks about this logical fallacy. The one being charged against the Madhyamika here by the opponent is the one known as Karyasama, or in Tibetan, Detsungi Dakche. It's called Detsungi Dakche in Tibetan, where the objection raised against one's opponent equally applies to one's own opposition. So one's own position, sorry. That's probably the best way to formulate it. So the objection that you raise, that you use to refute another position, if that can be equally applied to one's own position, then that is called a logical fallacy, because you're trying to establish your own system is correct and the other person is wrong. But here, Chandrakirti is being accused of his argument having that logical fallacy, because, well, the Svatantrika is arguing, I can ask you in the same way, the way you look at cause and effect. Do they meet or do they not meet? Or I can say the refutation, your refutation, refuting something, do they meet or not? In the same way, you can't answer that. You have the same problem here. So therefore, it says in 172, since your objections, so Chandrakirti or Prasangika, your objections rebound to your words as well, it can be applied to your own view, you're committing a logical fallacy. And so with no sound logic, you deny the existence of all phenomena. Okay, basically they're accusing Chandrakirti are falling into the extreme of nihilism. The sublime ones will never agree with you. The great Buddhas, Bodhisattvas will never agree with you, and with no position of your own. You're also simply abusing, and with no position of your own, you're also simply abusing the norms of refutation. So please don't forget, this is not Chandrakirti talking, verse 171, 172. It's the opponent arguing. And it's an interesting argument because we haven't had that argument before. So far, Chandrakirti, representing, of course, the Prasangika, has been arguing, well, if you believe phenomena exist inherently, then it would follow the I is either one with its aggregate or different from its aggregate. And if they're one, well, then why would you differentiate between I and aggregates? And if they're different, they would be disconnected. Or in the case of cause and effect, well, if you have a cause and effect and they exist inherently, either they would have to meet or not meet, and none of those, either they would have contact or not have contact, and none of them make sense. That's what Chandrakirti has accused, or that's the argument Chandrakirti has used against the other position. But then now the other position, or the followers of the other position, those who believe in inherent existence, are saying we use the same argument, and we're getting back at you saying, well, your sense of existence can be equally negated. If you negate our mode of existence, which is inherent existence, so believing in inherent existence, we're negating the way you look at phenomena and negate the existence of phenomena as you explain them based on the same arguments. So on fast hearing, it's like, that's a powerful argument. Well, yeah, I can get back at the Prasangika, right? I could just say, well, same problem, you have the same problem. You cannot account for this. Okay, so this is so far, verse 172, 172, no, so 171, 172, that's an opponent arguing. Now comes the answer. All right, so basically, I should also mention what the other person is, so what they're accused of here, 172, what the opponent is saying, you have no position of your own. That's important in 172. It's not just saying the same can be used for you, but you're just trying to negate everything. You have no position on your own. You're just simply abusing the norms of refutation. Okay, so that's important. And in response to that, now Chandrakirti gives a reply. First, he's saying that, first of all, the first part of this reply is showing that the refutation that Chandrakirti has presented, I mean, the refutation that he's applied towards others, it's tenable. There's no contradiction in terms of our own system. So this is not a logical fallacy. It does not, therefore, refute the Prasangika school. And this, he does so by two ways, in two ways. First, here the refutation of the other position is accepted on the conventional, how the refutation of others' position is accepted on the conventional level. That's the first part. And the second part of Chandrakirti's response is he establishes the Prasangika's own position, right? So the commentary reads, this has two parts, therefore, so his response, how the refutation of others' position is accepted on the conventional level and how the establishment of our own position is accepted. All right. Okay, so, and then there are some other aspects that come, actually, it's a four-part response, and the first part of it is divided into those two that I just read. Anyway, if you look at the commentary, hopefully it's clear. So the first response is made in the form of verse 173. Here, Chandrakirti says, the objection you have just raised, does your refutation refute what is to be refuted without coming into contact or by contacting it? Right? So taking the refutation, that was just being refuted, and then saying, do they come in contact or not? will certainly apply to someone who has a thesis, of inherent existence. Okay, will certainly apply to someone. So that can be applied to someone who believes in inherent existence. Since I do not have such such a thesis of inherent existence, these consequences do not follow. All right, so let me just put this into different words because it's not that straightforward. Basically, if you remember, maybe let's move away from cause and effect for a moment, but let's take the classic argument that, or the classic objection that Chandrakirti, or the Prasangika in general, so Chandrakirti is presenting when he's trying to refute, when he's refuting inherent existence. Okay, so what's the classic, what is the usual argument? We're all familiar with it by now. If the I exists inherently, we should be able to find it. That's one big argument. We should be able to find it upon engaging in ultimate analysis. So let's take the body and the mind. If the I existed inherently, there's only two possibilities. Either mind and body are one, or they're totally different. There's no other possibility. If phenomena existed inherently. So this is what he's saying in verse 173. If you hold this thesis of inherent existence, then these consequences will apply. These logical consequences, these logical extremes, I can present them to you. So whichever way you want to talk about it, the refutation, that which is being refuted, or cause and effect, or I and the aggregates. Well, here in this case, I use the example we're probably more familiar with. If phenomena existed inherently, then I can present this argument. Either the I is one with its aggregate or separate. Do those two possibilities also apply? Do those two possibilities also apply to a Prasangika person? The answer is no, because there's a third possibility. There's a third possibility. What are the two possibilities that are presented in the case of inherent existence? Either the I and the aggregates are one, or they're totally disconnected. No other possibility is given, right? These two possibilities, of course, they don't make sense. The Prasangika school does not believe that the I and the aggregates are one, and I do not believe that they're totally disconnected. So therefore, the Prasangika school has to present a third possibility. And they do. They say, well, mind and body are not the same. In fact, the I is merely labeled on the basis of the aggregates, with the aggregates also being merely labeled on the basis of their parts. But we don't need to focus on the aggregates here. But so we have these conventional aggregates, and based on those conventional aggregates, we label I. Okay? And that I, being merely labeled on the basis of merely labeled aggregates, they are connected to the aggregates. They're labeled on the basis of these aggregates. So they're connected, but not one. They're of one nature. They're of one nature, which means they're different, not the same, they're different, but not totally disconnected. All right. If they existed inherently, that third option is not an option. That wouldn't work. As we heard before, if they existed inherently, then either they would be totally disconnected to the aggregates because they exist inherently, so they don't need the aggregates. Or if you were to insist they don't need the aggregates, they do need the aggregates, they would have to be one with the aggregates. Because if they existed inherently, it would follow that they exist independently. So if the I existed inherently, it would follow it would exist independently of mind and body. And if you still insist it's connected, well, then they would have to be one with mind and body, because then it doesn't depend on anything other than itself. And that would, again, be all right for something to exist inherently. Okay, so therefore, with regard to the Prasangika school, they say when it comes to I and the aggregates, there is this third possibility. The other two extremes don't apply to us because we believe that phenomena are merely labeled. So it does not refute our own view. In the same way, when you have cause and effect, do they meet or do they not meet? They don't meet. But that doesn't mean they're disconnected. They don't meet. Cause and effect don't meet, because when you have a cause, its effect is not there yet. If you have the effect, its cause is gone. They never meet in terms of, there's never a time when they come together. It's impossible. But are they totally disconnected, therefore? No. They don't meet. They're not totally disconnected. Why? Because their existence is dependent on each other. An effect is only an effect because it has a cause, and a cause is only a cause because it has an effect. They're merely labeled independence on each other. But if you believe the cause is inherently a cause and inherently an effect is inherently an effect, well, they don't need each other. They don't need each other, all right, for their existence. So if you still insist they meet, then there would have to be one. Because, well, then if they exist inherently, they only need itself to exist. And if you insist the cause needs the effect needs the cause, and then they would have to be one, or they're totally disconnected. Those are the other two possibilities. And whether you use cause effect, you use the I and the aggregates, or the refutation and that which is refuted, they're merely labeled. The refutation is labeled on certain arguments. That which is being refuted is merely labeled. It's the view of the other person. That is merely labeled. And so do they meet or do they not meet? Well, no, they don't. I mean, do they meet? No, they don't meet, but they're also not totally disconnected. They're merely labeled. So there's a third possibility, which is not given if you believe in inherent existence. And that's what he says in verse 173. And the objection you just raised, this will apply to you as long as you hold the thesis of inherent existence. But since I have no such thesis, the thesis here refers to the thesis or the view of inherent existence. Since I have no such view, such a thesis, I don't hold this thesis, these consequences do not follow. For me, this is not a problem. And he goes on to say, just as the characteristics present in the sun can be seen in its reflections, such as when there is an eclipse, yet one can't speak in terms of whether the sun touches its reflections. Nonetheless, things originate through dependence as mere conventions. Now, this is a little difficult to understand. He uses here the analogy of as the sun and the reflection of the sun. All right, so the reflection, you've heard that word before, reflection, the reflection of a face in the mirror. It's mentioned in the next verse, actually. The reflection of a face in the mirror, or the reflection of the sun. For instance, you have the sun shining in the sky, and there's a body of still water on the ground, and you see a reflection of the sun in the water, okay? I don't know where exactly. I mean, we have the face in the mirror. We hear that all the time. Where suddenly does the sun and the reflection come from, especially at a time of an eclipse? I can only guess. I mean, in the olden days, people probably didn't have colored glass pieces they could use to safely look at the sun during an eclipse. So maybe they just used the reflection of water, and that was the sun wasn't as bright. It wasn't hurting the eyes badly as if I have no idea. I'm just guessing here. Anyway, the example Chandrakirti is given of the sun and the reflection. What is the reflection? The reflection of the sun in this body of water. Well, the reflection is not the sun. It seems to be the sun, but it doesn't exist as the sun. So this reflection is usually given as an example. It appears one way, it exists in a different way. So it appears to exist as the sun, the reflection in this water of body. It seems to be the sun. It looks to be the sun, but it doesn't exist as such. So, but still it exists. It's like an illusion, as it appears to be the sun, but it isn't. But nonetheless, we can say it exists. And based on that, we can come to understand the sun looks like this, it looks like this, and so forth. So that's the analysis here, the analogy given here. In the same way, phenomena look to exist inherently. A phenomenon seems to exist inherently, but it doesn't exist that way. And still, we can, based on that phenomenon, we can understand the characteristics. For instance, the eye doesn't exist inherently. It seems to exist inherently, but similar to an illusion, it doesn't exist inherently. It appears that way, but still we can know conventionally the characteristics of the eye. We can understand whether the person is kind or not, and so forth. So in that way, on a conventional level, it still works. That's the example he gives there for 174. Just as the characteristics present in the sun can be seen in its reflection in that lake or whatever, in that body of water, such as when there is an eclipse, for instance, yet one can't speak in terms of whether the sun touches its reflection. So on a conventional level, let's take the reflection. Here, we don't need to talk about the sun touching the reflection or not. We don't have to talk about it. There's no touching as such. The sun is the cause of the reflection, and that's it. But still, we can use this reflection on a conventional level. It appears to be the actual sun, but it isn't. There's no touching on a conventional level, like meeting, touching, coming in contact. No, that doesn't take place, and it still works perfectly. So nonetheless, that's possible. So nonetheless, things originate through dependence as mere conventions. So taking the example of the sun without touching and so forth. So in the same way, things originate through dependence as mere conventions. We say, well, there was something preceding it, and its existence was the existence of something now is dependent on what preceded it. And based on that, we labeled that which preceded it as its cause. And the result in turn, well, because it's now there, previously it wasn't there, and that which preceded it is responsible for it being there now. Therefore, we call that which preceded it, it's the cause. So based on that, we label cause and effect. But there's no need for anything to exist inherently. It's merely labeled and it still works. All right. Okay, so that's 174, and we need to finish it here. 175 really tells us the same thing. So a mirror image works the same way. It's a similar analogy. Also, though unreal, a mirror image exists. So it seems to be the actual face. If you look at your face in the mirror, it seems to be the actual face. So the mirror image exists, but not as the face, but it helps us to make up one's face. All right, it's not the face, and still we can use it effectively. It doesn't exist inherently. It's not the actual face. So in the same way, phenomena don't exist inherently. We can still use them. Just as a mirror image is not the face, but we can still use it to make up the face, to beautify the face, and so forth. In just the same way, understand that through reasoning, which has the power to cleanse the face of wisdom, one can realize the conclusion even with no objective evidence. So even though the evidence we use, it doesn't exist inherently, and we can still, based on a non-inherently existent evidence, we can still come to, well, attain or cleanse the face of wisdom, right? Through non-inherently existent reasoning, we can still generate wisdom, non-inherently existent wisdom, just as we can use the reflection of a face that's not an actual face. We can utilize that to beautify the face. In the same way, we can utilize a non-inherently existent reasoning to attain a non-inherently existent wisdom. So here's being very poetic, using the analogy, of course, of a reflection, which appears one way but exists in a different way. So likewise, phenomena appear to exist inherently in and of themselves, but they're merely labeled, and therefore they can function, they can exist, wisdom can be generated, and so forth. And these extremes, these two extreme possibilities don't cause any trouble. It's not that there's only these two possibilities and neither of them makes sense, and therefore the I can't exist, cause and effect cannot exist. That's what he's saying. I hope it's become clear. We need to leave it here now. We did quite a few verses here. And I'm not sure it's all understood. If not, well, please ask. You can always send an email to Dalit and just say, explain this verse again, that verse again, even if you have no specific question. So you're always welcome to do that. All right, that should be enough. And let's now meditate on it. Meditate on what we've just learned. Okay. Let's start again with some breathing. Just let go of any confusion, any disruptive attitude. Now, with regard to the way phenomena exist, everything that we perceive appears to exist inherently. Which would mean that if they existed that way, the I would either be one with its aggregates or totally disconnected. There's no third possibility. And a cause and its effect would either meet and thus become one, or they wouldn't meet and be totally disconnected. But these extremes do not apply to the present Giga school. For there's another option. If phenomena are merely labeled, if the I is merely labeled on mind and body, which also merely labeled. Such conventional I and those conventional aggregates are neither one nor completely different and disconnected. Instead, they're of one nature. And that they are not identical, but their existence is dependent on each other. Similarly, if you have a seed that is a merely labeled cause in dependence on its resultant sprout, and a merely labeled result that is a result in dependence on its cause, then those two don't have to meet. I can still be connected. Which is a possibility that is logically impossible if cause and effect existed inherently. A conventional cause that is a seed and a conventional result that is a sprout. never exist at the same time as cause and effect. And therefore do not meet or come in contact. Yet the result is labeled result independence on its preceding cause. And the cause, that is the seed, is labeled cause. Independence on its subsequent result. Hence, cause and effect are merely labeled cause and effect in dependence on each other. Without any type of causeness being found in the seed or any type of resultness being found in the sprout. Similarly, the eye is merely labeled on the basis of the parts of the eye. And the parts of the eye are merely labeled dependence on the eye. Without any I-ness being inherent in a body or a mind. Or any being a part of an I being inherent in a body or mind. So now, to conclude this analysis, spend a few moments single-pointedly just focusing on whichever insight you've gained. And then let's dedicate whatever virtue, whatever positive potential we've accumulated today. May it become a cause for us to become fully enlightened. Attain at some point the enlightenment of a Buddha for the welfare of all sentient beings. And in the meantime, may it become a cause for the life of our great spiritual masters like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Karmapa, and all the other great lamas to have a long and healthy life, so that they can continue to teach us from their own realizations, their own experience. And may our positive potential we accumulate, and may it have a positive effect on the people around us. Help them to find more peace of mind, overcome illness, like in the case of Tali Lubin. And in general, find more happiness and satisfaction. And of course, as described in Shantideva's prayer, may all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, attain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored and finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then, may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Okay, thank you very much. And lastly, just to remind you, for this week, we're actually focusing on equalizing and exchanging self with others. So having equalized, now we're trying this process of exchanging. And as I said before, not that you really become the other person, but that the other person, as since so far your I was the focus, my well-being is the focus. Now it's like you become the I, or that focus becomes the other person, their well-being, their reputation, their health. That stands in the forefront. That is what's most important. So it's like you change that focus, as in like you become this other person, or well, less than that, but more it's like the focus becomes the other person. So the focus in terms of their well-being, that's the other person. That is really important. Try that with as many people as you can, maybe with more than one person, possibly like a group of people. It's like not the I, it's not its well-being is in the center of your daily life, but it's the other person's well-being. So to do that, as in like you exchange with this other person, and also become aware, in particular with regard to the body, that it's just a matter of familiarity. There's no reason why I consider my own body to be more precious than another person's body. And possibly remember the example I gave, how it's just being familiar with this particular kind of body. So to focus on that in your meditation, in your daily life, but also, of course, to focus on bodhicitta, to not let go, generate the mind again and again. All right, that should be enough for today. Have a great week, and see you again next week, next Sunday. All right.
Thank you, Geshe-ma.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.